Hi guys, Mrs. Horman again. This is Global Contemporary Day 2 of 9. Or video 2 of 9. And this week, what we're working on is some really cool global contemporary art um, that is from around the world and one of my favorites in the entire world. So this is a piece called Horn Players by Jean-Michel Basquiat. So Jean-Michel Basquiat he began as a graffiti artist in the punk scene in the late 70s into the early 80s. So what you're looking at here is a triptych. So if you'll remember, we had triptychs in the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance church triptychs that opened and closed. So this is called a triptych. It doesn't actually open and close, but it is in 3 panels, and you can see they're separated into 1 and then 2 and then 3 panels. So you're looking at acrylic and oil paint stick, which is kind of like painting a little bit with a almost like a crayon, but it's oil paint on 3 canvases. So Jean-Michel Basquiat is probably most famous for being first a graffiti artist, second a friend of Andy Warhol's, and third a member of what they call the 27 Club. He died by a heroin overdose in 1988 at the age of 27. So the really sad thing when you're talking about Jean-Michel Basquiat is the things that he could have accomplished if he had lived. So his parents were Puerto Rican and Haitian. He grew up in New York City. He grew up middle class, and his parents were pretty well off, and he really saw his art career as a way to really rebel against his very proper middle class upbringing. He felt like he had a voice. He felt like he wanted to say something. He felt like he wanted to sort of rebel against all of the societal expectations for him. He was incredibly brilliant. And he is very much a thinking artist. He is, however, the perfect example of the excesses of the art world in the 1980s. He used to hang out with Andy Warhol. They used to go to clubs, and they were just the center of everything because the art world in the late 80s was really where it was at. And so he sort of is the embodiment of that sort of excess. He is what we often call, you can call him a punk scene graffiti artist. You can call him a neo-expressionist. You can call him an American punk artist. All of those sort of fit what he was doing. He's very similar to Banksy in that his art is thinking art. His art is protest art. His art is social realism and social justice art. He very much wanted to focus on African, Caribbean, and African American influences. He did, in a very short time, more than 2,000 works. More than 30 of them are about music. He was an absolutely skilled draftsman. He could draw the human form perfectly. He was just an amazing artist. And this is he sort of did graffiti art. He learned human form, um, classical drawing, and then he returned to sort of this reintroduction of of, of the human form in his own style, in his abstract expressionist style. He is often compared to Kandinsky, who did improvisation, de Kooning, who did woman, Picasso, um, who did the Women of Avignon. He really is seen as being this avant-garde, forward-thinking, a brilliant artist. Picasso was a brilliant draftsman too, could draw the human form like nobody else. Once said something like he and Miro talked about Jean Miro, M.I.R.O. They talked about how they lived their whole lives learning how to draw like children, and to try to finally return to that sort of free flowing style that you have as a child, and you don't feel like you're bound up by the constraints of society. Like I said, this is a triptych, so it has a hints at a religious piece, but it's also, as I said, is he's a thinking man's artist. So this is, they believe, is based on or echoes, not based on, but it's sort of like comes from Basquiat looking at this piece by Picasso called The Three Musicians. And so here you see Picasso's piece, and then you come back here and you see Basquiat's piece. And if you know jazz, then stuff is jumping out at you. And if you don't know jazz, then you might be a little confused about what you're looking at. And so the main subjects here are Dizzy Gillespie, who played the trumpet, and Charlie Parker, who played the saxophone. And so here you see Dizzy Gillespie and his trumpet. You see Charlie Parker and his saxophone. And these were famous jazz musicians. Now, then you start getting into sort of the digging deeper into what you're looking at as far as the stuff that's up there. So this is a linguistic and a visual portrait. Visual as in pictures, linguistic as in words. So ornithology is a composition by Charlie Parker. But ornithology is also the study of birds. And so you sort of have to know a little bit of your history. Charlie Parker was known as Charlie, and his nickname was Bird Parker. And so ornithology is the name of one of his compositions, but also the study of birds, and he's Charlie Bird Parker. And so you get sort of this play on words here. You see pre down here, Pree. That's his daughter's name, and you see some of these words just sort of stuck in here. Larynx, that the part of your thing that makes the sound. Gillespie, you see Dizzy Gillespie here, and then it says do shu db, and that has a lot to do with jazz music and a wordless improvisation in jazz music called scat, where you just sort of make those sort of words that are really sounds that sort of help make music, that these musicians were famous for. And so what you have here, when I say to you this is a thinking man's piece, you've got to know that ornithology is the study of birds, and that Charlie Parker was known as Charlie Bird Parker. And you've got to know that alchemy is a composition by Dizzy Gillespie, and you've got to know who Dizzy Gillespie is. And you can see it here, Dizzy Gillespie, and you can see, you get the hints at it here, but it's not laid out for you perfectly. And so what you see is Basquiat holding on to this concept of it makes you think. It requires your background knowledge. It requires you to interpret many things. It requires you to focus on contrast. It requires you to focus on the movement of your eye around the composition. It requires you to be willing to say, I don't know what that is. Let me see if I can do some searching and some looking up. It's really, really just a beautiful work. And Basquiat is famous for these sorts of mix of like this skull shape shows up in several of his other pieces. He has a history of Africa, which is a beautiful, beautiful piece, and it's based on an African mask. But you can see that in some places he's drawn, in some places he's used a paintbrush, in other places he's used the paint stick, in other places it looks like he's used a roller. It's a multi-panel work. It is a thinking work. It's just really, really a beautiful work that makes you think and asks you to use your brain and be willing to look at something that's different. If only, he had lived longer, the work I think that he would be doing in this time period would be amazing. But alas. This next piece is called Summer Trees, and it is an abstracted piece, as clearly you can see. These are not realistic trees. They are abstracted. They're not completely abstract because they are meant to look like trees, and you can even see the hint of, like, here's the trunk, top of the tree. And you see some cool things here. So your artist is Song Sunam, 1983, and you'll see that it says ink on paper. And what's really the best about this piece, and what I love about this piece, is taking these ancient and traditional materials, Chinese ink, and painting it in a new style, this very forward thinking, this very contemporary, this very abstracted style, but using these ancient ways of making art. And so because, and look at the size of it too. It's like, it's tall. It's 48 inches long by 28 inches high. I mean, it's big. It's a big thing. But what you're looking at is its tonal variations: black, dark gray, light gray, white. You get this really beautiful mix of these tonal varieties. You see this feathering in the edges where the ink has been put on the paper. And there are places where the paper is wet and you get that feathering. And then that's what that comes from, is from putting wet wet ink onto wet paper. It sort of bleeds a little bit. You get that feathering, but then you get these really dark places where you're putting the ink right onto dry paper. And he allows it to drip in some places. There are even places where there's some ink powder that is sprinkled on to give it some texture. And so it's this idea of this new ink painting style with these washes and the dripping and the ink powder, which is very similar to traditional Chinese and Korean work. But here you have forms that overlap. Here you have a minimalist abstracted tree. Trees are symbolic of people and friends and things like that. They are symbolic of nature and things that come full circle. And so you have these very strong ties. And it's a word that we use in art, this iconography. Trees are peaceful and natural and symbolic. And here we have used these ancient symbols and ancient materials in a very new and fresh and different way. I love this, if for no other reason than that material usage, these very old materials being used in a way that the original users of, think a traveler among the mountains and streams, and then imagine that you were to show this piece to Fan Quan and say, hey, what do you think about these trees? And Fan Quan would have been like, what trees? I don't see any trees. So it's this idea that we're looking at similar materials, just used in a way that is a new thing. I can almost hear David Whitney right now thinking, I could do that. right? But you didn't do it first. You weren't the first one to take ancient Korean ink, an ancient Korean, you know, the ancient recipe for this beautiful Korean art paper and use it to do something like this. And it is this concept that we do something new and different that's never been done. It does draw the eye, and it causes us to have a very different response to it. Some of us like the response we have to it, some of us do not. Speaking of having a response, wait till you see this next piece. So this piece is called Androgyny, by Magdalena Abankowitz. I do this every time. Abankowitz. She died like 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. She was a prolific artist. She was born in 1930. She was already making art when she was a teenager, and she made art from about the mid 40s all the way until her death, um, like 2 years ago, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago at the most. And so, we're really dealing with a just prolific artist. Prolific meaning made a lot of stuff and just made art for a really long time. So what you're looking at is a composition called Androgyny 3. Yes, there is a 1 and a 2 and a 4. So you have to sort of start with, this is one of those ones where you can't start with what you're looking at. You have to start with the artist. And so when we look at her life, we have to start with, she was born in 1930. Um, uh, they were very, very wealthy, her family. They were Polish. Um, when she was like 1943, she was 12 or 13. The Nazis came to her family estate in Poland. Yeah, they were wealthy, so estate. They threatened her parents. They shot her mother, and her mother didn't die, but her arm had to be amputated. And because they were this wealthy aristocracy, the Nazis came in and seized everything that belonged to them. And Magdalena and her family fled to Warsaw. And so when she was a teenager, she was working as a nurse, and she was caring for wounded people in Warsaw, both the average Polish citizen, and also she was forced to take care of Nazis, but she had to hide her aristocratic roots because she didn't want her family didn't want the Nazis to treat them badly. And then when the communists took over, after the war was over, they had to continue to hide their aristocratic roots, so that the communists wouldn't, punish them. And she talked about, for a very long time, for the latter half of her career, she talked about how the war caused her family to lose everything. And there's an amazing quote from her that says, "We as a family lost our identity. We were deprived of our social position, thrown out of society. We were punished for being rich. I had to hide my background. I had to lie. I had to reinvent who I was." And so she, when she's in Warsaw, she goes to the Academy of Fine Arts, and she begins to study social realism, which is the idea, but sort of like a twisted communist idea of social realism, where you're looking at the required social realism, where it's a perfect society and everyone's smiling and all the workers are happy and everything's. Think about the results of the first 5-year plan. And so she when Stalin dies, some of the 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 requirements of what her art had to be sort of loosened up a little bit. In the late 1960s, around 1967, she started making art that was made out of fabric and tapestry. And then in the 80s, she began to add burlap, which is like sacks for flour and stuff like that. She began to add string. She began to add gauze. Then in the late 70s into the early 80s, she began to use resin, which is like a plastic material, to then cause the fabric, the burlap and the nails and the burlap and the fabric and the string to make certain forms. And she would put them around forms and she would mold them and cast them. And so what you're looking at now that you've got all of this is a woman who watched her mother be shot by the Nazis. They were thrown out of their house. She was forced to live in poverty in Warsaw and hide everything it was about her while the Nazis were in power. And then when the communists came into power, they still had to hide. Um, they lost pretty much everything. And she begins to make art, and she's told that her art has to look this way because everybody has to be seen as being happy and wonderful and perfect and everything's fabulous. And then finally, when she can make her art the way she wants to make her art, she makes this. Now, College Board gives you this image, which is okay-ish, but it's really only okay if they were to give you two images. So this is androgyny from the back, but this piece is sculpted in the round, and it is meant to be seen in the round. And what do I mean sculpted? So this is an additive sculpture. Remember we talk about subtractive sculpture when we have a big block of marble and we cut everything away and we have a subtractive sculpture, but this is an additive sculpture. She built that frame out of wood. She took the burlap, she put it onto a mold, and she cast it. And so what you're looking at is the back of it. Now it's really important you see it from the sort of the side front. And so when you're looking at this and you're looking at this creation that Magdalena creates, from the back, it clearly is the torso of a human being. You can see where the spine is, the impression of the arms, the impression of the buttocks. You see this sort of like the litter or cot that you would move the wounded in, and so you see, this torso, this body, but look at the skin. The burlap has been hardened with the resin, and it looks like just sort of this. It looks like this skin. It looks like this terrible, wrinkled, scarred, terribly injured skin. But notice that when we look at the title, androgyny, neither gender, right? Androgynous, neither gender. And the front is not prescriptive. We don't know what that looks like. And the reason is that androgyny, we're not meant to focus on the gender of the figure of the torso. We are meant to focus on their humanity. And so she said that she was very much impacted by caring for people who were horrifically wounded during World War II, and by the brutality of war, and by the brutality of the totalitarian state. And so really you have a body without really legs or arms, or completely without legs. This really is a piece about suffering. This is a piece about pain. This is a piece that is expressive. This is a piece that is sad and disturbing and mournful. And it's one of those ones where knowing the life of the artist helps you understand what you're looking at. And so when you look at it from the back, it's clearly a person. But when you think about the title androgyny, look at it from the front. She doesn't want you to worry about whether it's a male or a female. She wants you to think about a human figure and the hollowness of life that comes with this. This person is like a shell. It's a shell of a person because of the terrible things that war and society and life and all of those things do to you. You end up with this just emptiness. I love her work. I love the different materials that are in her work. I love the expression and the emotion that is. So androgyny, which then leads us to a significantly different piece from that. Like these pieces are really cool. You've got like got your graffiti, you've got your abstracted trees, you've got your burlap form, and then you've got this. And the four from today's are just so different from each other. This is called Book from the Sky by Zhu Bing, created between 1987 and 1991. It is a mixed media installation made of hand printed books, paper that drapes the ceiling and the walls, and all of these things, these hand printed books, the paper on the ceiling, the paper on the walls, like all of the scrolls that are draped there are all printed with wood letterpress type that was crafted by the artist. Mostly you're dealing with ink on paper, and each of the books that's here, and that's what you see here, like that's a book, that's a book, that's a book, that's a book, there, then here's another one, then there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there. Okay, so you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books. And if we go this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I mean, it just keeps going. So you're dealing with the books are 18 by 20 when they're open. And then there are 3 ceiling scrolls. You can see them. 1, 2, 3 ceiling scrolls. And then the wall scrolls are 9 feet high and 40 feet long. Okay, so you're looking at a lot of ink. This is a Chinese-born artist, Zhu Bing, who now lives in the United States. The original title of this piece was An Analyzed Reflection of the End of the Century, because, coming up on the year 2000, end of the 1900s. It was originally shown at the National Museum in Beijing. And then some stuff happened with it, and it was purchased by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that is where it is now in this installation. And when you do the math here, 7 by however many, there's more than 400 of these handmade books. And you can see one right here. There's also another one down here so that you can look at the exhibit from either end. That's another doorway. We're standing in one doorway looking at a book here. There's another doorway with a book there so that you can see a sample of the book here and then these books here. So there are more than 400 of these handmade books. And what happens is that you come in here and you walk around and you can look at the scrolls here, you can look at the scrolls there, you can walk around and come back out. And what you're looking at is you're looking at these scrolls that hang from the ceiling, these scrolls that are on the wall, these books that are in front of you, and they're all covered with this type. Look at all of this, like there's this big, big section here, little type here, even smaller type here. And I mean, look at how much just so much printing and inking, and look at all of the books as they're laid open with the text in them. Here are the pages, the wood blocks that he made. Each one of these is the character, and you can see that he then inks them and presses them. But the thing that is odd about this particular creation, and actually I'll leave it here, is when you're looking at this, you're looking at very traditional Chinese woodblock techniques. That is a traditional woodblock. That is how you print pages and papers and books and stuff like that. Except what you have to have a certain knowledge to understand what you're looking at. And if you spoke Chinese and could read and write Chinese, you would be looking at this, and you would be very confused, because these are not real Chinese characters. Zhu Bing created more than 1,000 of his own air quote Chinese characters that are not really Chinese characters, and he created his own language. And so what happened is that he makes these books, and he makes these scrolls, and he makes all of this stuff with all of this. Let me let my dog out. I'm so sorry. Kiwi, you go downstairs. So he makes all of these things with these Chinese characters on them, but they're not really Chinese characters. And he makes all of these books with all of this stuff written on it, but it's not anything that you can read. It's invented. It's false. It's fake. It's nothing that's real. And that is because this is a protest piece. Okay, this is a social commentary piece. This is a protest piece about propaganda and the Chinese government and the Chinese state. He created this to basically explain that this text says nothing, because text can be made to say what you want it to say. Words can be made to get across whatever it is that you want them to do. This is a comment on Chairman Mao, who believed that woodblock belonged to the common man, and many of his early writings were distributed through through woodblock pamphlets. Um, but he's commenting on the fact that, don't forget that Chinese characters, these or the ones that are real, can be twisted to look like and say anything you want them to say. Um, and some things that look like they're real are not. And that is what he's saying here. He says, look, you can be looking at these books and these things, and it can look like it's really real books and real characters, but it's not. And know that when you are looking at propaganda magazines and things that are released by the Chinese government, it may look real, but it's not. And you need to be careful about what you're looking at, and what you think and believe about what you're looking at, because the government can take anything that you have made and make it say what they want it to say. And so this comes from the fact that as a young man, Zubing was taken from his family because he was identified as a child as having a very clear talent for calligraphy. He was taken from his family. He was shipped out to basically a communist artists camp, where he and people like him were forced to create documents and posters and signs and flags and all kinds of stuff for the communist regime. And they were forced into making these propaganda materials. And this work is him saying, just because it says this doesn't mean that it actually is real. So the characters are empty of meaning. You see the books that are open, that sort of ripple, are meant to echo water. The sky is above you, and so it's sort of like cloudy and billowy. So you have those scrolls that hang down. It's landscape next to you, and so he wants you to just be careful when you read what your government tells you or what anyone tells you, because just because it looks like it's a genuine thing, it may not be. And so, we have seen, this may look just like graffiti and it's nothing, but there's way more to it than that. This may look just like streaks of paper, but there's way more to it than that. This might look like the back of a person, but there's way more to it than that. This may look like books and scrolls, but there's way more. So that's the thing that's sort of underlying with a lot of contemporary art. A lot of contemporary art seems much more simple than it actually is. There is a lot of complexity to contemporary art that really needs to be explored. And contemporary art is thinking art. You've really got to think about what's going on around you, and you've got to do your homework to really understand it all. So that is Global Contemporary Video 2. And like I said, there's 9 in total. So let's keep moving.